There was a young woman that I met probably 15, maybe 20 years ago when I asked her the question, "Where are you going home for Christmas?" She had a puzzled look on her face. And it was at that moment I realized I had asked maybe a very difficult and perplexing question for her to answer. To ask, "Are you going home?" her immediate response was, "Well, where's home?" She had come from a broken home. Her father and mother had divorced. She had been closer to her mother, not spending as much time with her father. Both parents had remarried and they had had children of their own. And so she had 6 step-siblings. In the midst of that, her mother had passed away, but she was still closer with her stepfather and then his new wife. And suddenly, home didn't seem quite like home anymore. Where did she belong? Where did she fit in? And so when I had asked the question, "Are you going home for Christmas?" the questions were swirling in her mind. How do I answer this? What do I say? This is a story from 15, 20 years ago. It's even more so the case now. If that's how it was in the early 2000s, today what we find is that there is increased fracture in the nuclear family. And people struggle to understand what it means to be a family. Even in our own community, where people look like their lives are well put together, I just know from several of the children and young people of our church that their classmates are often coming from very broken homes. And so even though it looks like we live in a world that's very intact, or even our community can feel very intact, the reality is there is brokenness all around us. The nuclear family has been something that has really been pivotal in Western society. It's been a key building block for society. But over the last several decades, this is radically changing. There are several factors that I just want to consider before we come to Deuteronomy 6 that have really played into a dramatic change in Western culture. The first is that marriage is no longer seen as the foundation for society, but as a personal preference or choice. Society used to be built upon the structure of marriage between a husband and a wife, and it was designed in this way to promote family and stability. Taxation benefits were designed to encourage family life. Workplaces were designed for this. All of life was really designed in many ways to encourage the development of family, and yet that began to erode. In the 1990s, between 65 and 75% of 30-year-olds could have said that they were married. Today, that statistic would be somewhere between 20 and 30% of 30-year-olds ever get married at that point. And so there has been a dramatic shift in terms of entering into a marriage relationship. Marriage has become something that is niche, or it's been redefined. It's something that is a personal option and preference. And so in its definition, people have changed what it means to suit the cultural moment. So we have gay marriage, and we have marriage where people are wedding inanimate objects. I've heard of people marrying plants. Or there was one case where a woman married herself. And so when this is what the word marriage becomes to mean, it becomes meaningless. If it means everything, it means nothing. It's just like saying love is love, which is enormously problematic, which is not any sort of definition of love, and it doesn't help to understand what that means. It just only adds confusion upon confusion. And because society is no longer built on marriage as a structural foundation, believing that from the very beginning God had designed Adam and Eve as the most basic governing structure in society, we have lost any sense of the most basic building blocks of an organization for society. The second factor that has contributed to this is not just that marriage is now a preference that people choose to enter into, but children are seen as either an economic burden or as just bad in and of themselves. Children in the ancient world and even through up into the beginning of the industrial age, children were very important because you would have children and there was a high infant mortality rate. Many of your kids did not survive till the age of 18. You had large families. They were your employment insurance. They were your Canadian pension plan. They were your future. They were the guarantee for help on the farm if you got sick. But today, as work has dramatically changed and as we've shifted our understanding of work, children have become an economic burden. The United States Department of Agriculture in 2017 estimated that the average cost for raising one child was $233,610 American. Now, that is a lot of money. And is it any wonder that people choose dogs over kids? It's far easier in some cases. And what do your sense of obligation and duty can be less to an animal than to a child. And yet there is great attachment that we've had as a culture towards animals. So much so that we have our furry families, which is very wonderful to have pets that are so connected to us, but we begin to treat them as though they are children themselves. And so we've seen children as a burden because they're an economic burden. They are costly. It costs so much to raise them, to send them off to university, to help them. But added to that, there's been a new development in terms of how our society thinks about children. Today, our society, there are climatologists who, in light of climate change, say that having children is evil. And the reason that children are evil is because you're increasing the carbon footprint. And as you have children, what you're doing is you're destroying the planet. So the more children you have, the more evil you are. And this is the kind of thinking that children now are an economic burden and they are an ecological disaster. And so having children just becomes something then that is a personal preference and choice, but really ought to be discouraged, evidenced by rapidly declining fertility rates across the Western world. So in light of marriage being seen as a personal choice and children being seen as both a burden and an evil, the post-family structure is becoming the new norm. The new norm has become that relationships are fluid, that there is no solidity to them, that you slide in and out of relationships, that they come and they go. And you jettison relationships when they are no longer convenient to you. Just like you upgrade a car, you upgrade your partner. And so you change these things. And you have developed now this sense of, if it makes me happy, which is the ruling mindset as to whether or not we have a relationship with anyone. The family used to be the basic structure where we formed discipleship, where we formed citizens. But no longer do we view the family as the structure for developing citizens. It's the place now where I have a family so that I can choose to be happy. But if I'm not happy, then I change the structure of it or I remove myself from it. And these post-family structures are incredibly fluid and are incredibly unstable. And the last factor, for Christians in particular, in light of all of these things, and we could say a lot more, there's so many more factors, but the last thing is that Christians who live in a culture where there is so much going on, so many redefinitions, so much rethinking, so many changes, so much fluidity, no longer think Christianly. And so people use the language of partner instead of husband or wife because it's awkward at work to talk about your spouse. Or we are struggling to know how do we talk about the fact that we have kids when people don't really like children when they're an economic and ecological burden. And so it's important for Christians to remember that the primary language that the New Testament uses to describe the Church of Jesus Christ is familial language. God is our Father. Jesus Christ is His only begotten Son. That Christ is our bridegroom who is coming for His bride. That when we, by faith, believe in Jesus Christ, we are adopted into God's family. That we are fellow heirs with Christ to the promises of God. The New Testament is full, chock full of family language, which means that we need to understand then how to think biblically. But when the world seems like it's in total chaos in terms of understanding family, where do we start? I want to start this morning at Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 9. This is what Moses, as Moses preaches to the people of Israel, as they're about to go into the promised land, Moses preaches these words. Verse 4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." Where do we start when we begin to think about the family? We start where the Bible starts. And the first thing is, we start with the Lord our God. This is what Moses does as he speaks to the children of Israel. He starts, when we set the context here, we start with God because we have to remember where Israel was starting from. Israel, if you recall, they had come out of Egypt. They had been slaves in Egypt. They had been oppressed. They had seen the destruction of their baby boys thrown into the Nile, infanticide going on, a destruction, a genocide of a culture. And God had rescued them and brought them out, and they had wandered in a wilderness for 40 years. And as they had wandered in that wilderness for 40 years, they now were on the verge of coming into their new homeland, the promised land, the land that God had promised to Abraham. And as they were about to come into this land, Moses, as he knows his days are coming to an end, as he's about to die, he preaches a sermon, several sermons to Israel, which is what Deuteronomy is. It's several sermons that he preaches to Israel. And as he preaches, he reminds Israel of the commands that God had gave them at Mount Sinai. This is Deuteronomy 5. He reiterates the 10 Commandments. And he reminds them, this is a new way for us to live. We've got to live as free people, not as slaves. We've got to live as settled people, settled in God and settled in His land, not as nomads and wandering. And so he reminds them that as they go into a land that is full, chock full of foreign gods, that the Lord, their God, the Lord is one. Literally, Moses says, Yahweh, your God, Yahweh is one. He uses this covenant name of God, this name of God that God had revealed to Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 3, and he speaks, this is the God who has covenanted to be with His people, that He has borne witness to who He is as God. The other gods of the nations, they will demand, and they will demand, and they will demand, they will demand. You want success, you want the rains, you want crops, then you got to give, and you got to give, and you got to give. But Yahweh is not a God who is demanding and demanding and demanding, but is a God who gives. He gives of His very own self. In fact, we can see this in the commandment in Deuteronomy 5 that we often translate it as, do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. It literally has the sense of, don't take the name of God in vain because you bear the name. Do not bear the name of God in vain. That it's not merely about speaking the name, it's about living as the people of God. That God has bestowed upon His people a name, His name. Just as a wife will often take her husband's last name to identify that they are covenanted together, that God has given His name upon His people, and they bear His name. And in bearing His name, they represent Him. They live with Him and for Him. And by taking this name, bearing this name, God has given it to them because He is saying, I am so committed to you I will work for your good. I will work for your joy. This is what it means when it says that Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. He's not like the many gods of the nations. He is the one true God. Practically, what this means then is if God is so devoted to His people, then the call for His people is to be devoted to Him. This is not some sort of rule-keeping relationship. This is a covenant marriage between the God of heaven and His people on earth. And He's calling them into this divine relationship of love, which means that when we start to talk about the family, we start by talking about the Lord, Yahweh, our God. Practically, it means, as He will say, verse 5, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. That to love God in this way, as Jesus will reiterate, that this is the greatest command that is given. He will reiterate it to remind us that being devoted to God means our desires, your heart, are aligned with God. That your mind is thinking in light of God. That your soul is living for God. That it's what you do with your hands and your mouth and your thoughts. That it's all devoted to the glory of God. That it's thinking, desiring, working, living. It's not a relationship out of rules. It's a relationship that is devoted out of the heart. Do you see that in verse 6? That these commands are to be written where? On your heart. God had given the Ten Commandments initially on stone. Moses had gone up the mountain, the Mount Sinai. He had taken 2 tablets that he had carved, and God had etched into the stone His commandments. But the problem with the stone was that the commandments on stone could never change a heart. They could never work to change people's lives. That outward, external commands were only that. What was needed was those commands to be internalized. They needed to come in to the heart. And so this begins with, are you devoted to God? The God who is devoted to you calls you to be devoted to Him. This is where we start. We don't start by talking about family structures and government policies and better ways of doing ministry. We start by talking about the God who is devoted to His people as the husband of His people, who so dearly loves them, He has bestowed upon them His name. And He wants them to know His ways and His word, which means that they need to internalize it. They need to know it. It's good to spend 1 hour of the week gathering together here, but if this is the only time where we crack this book open, then the very words of God are not getting into us. That loving God is more than 1 hour. It is a life. And so we start with a God who is devoted to His people always and forever, which means that we are called to be devoted to Him. And so we start with the Lord our God. But the second thing is, in verses 7 through 9, what we see is that when we start with the Lord our God, that means that all of life needs to be informed with God and by God. This is why Moses will say to the people that they're to teach and give instructions to the next generation. They're to teach them diligently. But this teaching is not some 1 hour a week or at some religious ceremony or festival, but it's to inform all of life. Do you see what he says there? As you sit by the table, as you walk along the way, as you lie down, as you rise up, verse 7. In other words, that the information, the knowledge of God is to infiltrate life, all of life. That knowing God is to inform, what does this mean about my work? How do I work for God? What does that even mean if I'm an engineer or I'm a lawyer or if I'm doing administrative tasks? What does it mean for me to rest? In a world where work is rest and rest is work, we play at our work and we work at our play. We have to work to rest, and we rest to work. We have mixed up our categories so that we struggle to know how to live. How does God teach me to rest, to work? How does He teach me to think about relationships so that I live with wisdom when people struggle in sin? And how do I live in relationships rightly? How do I love? And what does it mean to love? Does God inform what it means to love? You see, as we read God's word, what we find, Moses says, it's not merely this formal act of teaching, even what I'm doing right now. This is just one part of teaching. But he says it's as you sit together, as you stand, as you walk along the road, as you lie down, as you rise up. It's more than a classroom setting because more is caught than taught. The words that we speak can be invalidated by actions that are totally contrary. What is needed are actions that are consistent with words. It's not that words are unimportant, it's that actions and words must connect. And when they connect, they have a powerful bearing on the reality of truth, the truth of how we ought to live. And then it begins to inform how we think. And we are all in process of being those who have come out of Egypt and out of the house of bondage and slavery of sin and learning to live in light of the freedom of God. So we're all in process. But in light of the fact that we're all in process, we're increasingly being conformed to this good word by internalizing it. That it would be written on our hearts. So that just as David prayed, your word have I hid in my heart, that I might not sin against you, Psalm 119, verse 11, that we internalize this word, that we memorize this word, that we take this word in. We need examples of that. Do our families see us only opening this book on a Sunday? Or do they see us opening these books, this book in particular, throughout the week? I've mentioned my dad before, and he's been such a good and godly example to me, and I don't know where I would be without him. I know every morning where he would be when I woke up, what he would be doing. He would have his Bible, he would have his coffee, he would have his Bible memory cards, he would be praying. And he set this example. And then he would corral 4 boys and a little girl around the table, and he would read Bible stories to us after dinner, and he would ask us questions, and we would then take turns praying. And these were the regular rhythms and practices that we did as a family. Now, it wasn't always every night of the week, and it wasn't always consistent, but it was what my dad did. But there were times where we had questions when we were listening to the radio. And as we were on the way, going here or there, we would ask some question about some story in the news. And my dad, being versed in the Scriptures, would bring some sort of response from not politics, but from this book, to what he understood God to teach. And amazingly, even as we would lie down at night, they had this amazing strategy as kids. I'm sure some of you kids have had this strategy too. It's time for bed and it's time to ask lots of questions because you don't want to go to sleep. I get it. But the reality is, moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas and aunts and uncles, sometimes it's not merely a distraction and not trying to go to sleep. It's sometimes trying to process the world that is so confusing. As I slow down, as I lie down, what happens to my mind? My mind is full of the things of the day, and I need someone to help me process these things. And so as we sit and as we're driving along and as we lie down, what we need are the conversations that are informing all of life about the ways of God. Every moment, every day. From the beauty of the flowers in the garden to the complexities of the politics on the news, to the difficult relationships at school, to what my career paths should be as I grow up, to all of the things that are in between. God's Word has something to say about all of this, to help me. Yes, it's a complex book. Yes, it's full of things that we struggle to understand, and it takes a lifetime of piecing and working and understanding how this all fits together. But we can know God and we can know the ways to live a godly life. You see, if God is so devoted to us that we bear His name, then should we not bear His name by being devoted to Him and knowing Him? You see, family ministry exists because God is our Father. Simply put. And you don't have to have a family to be involved with family ministry. What you have is a church family, and in growing together as the people of God, what we need is to know God as our Father and to love one another as brothers and sisters, and all the more so in a world where relationships are fractured and broken. We need examples of godly older men for younger men, godly older women for younger women. We need to see mothers who are in action and moms who know how they would do things differently. We need the wisdom of generations being shared. We need fathers who can encourage young men to step up. We need grandparents who love the grandkids, even if they're not their own grandkids. We need aunts and uncles, and we need single people, and we need all of each other so that we would be the people of God. Family ministry exists not to make us happy, but to teach us what it means to be like our Father. Family has always existed as a forming society. Our world has changed that, so family has become that which only exists as long as it makes me happy. And I upgrade my family just like I upgrade a car, something new and shinier and better. But that's not God's way. That God has given us one another so that we would be formed, shaped, to look like Him, to love Him, to know Him. That each of us, as we work together, as we rub on one another, as there's frictions, what we are learning and struggling and doing is we are becoming the family of God, reflecting our Father who so dearly loves us. You see, fall ministry, it's going to be a change. It's going to be a change for you and for me. And yes, there'll be fun, and yes, there'll be conveniences, and yes, there'll be Bible studies and small groups and things for kids and youth. But the main aim is that just as the knowledge of God would cover the earth as waters cover the sea, our desire is that you would know God and the knowledge of God would fill your life, informing every aspect of your life just as the waters cover the sea. That your knowledge of God would grow so that you're formed like Him. That as we know Him, and then as I think of that young woman, when I asked her the question, "Are you going home for Christmas?" And when she couldn't answer the question initially, what shocked me was the answer that she did come back with. Well, as much as she had come from a broken home, she said, "Actually, I'm looking forward to coming back here. This church is my family. This is where it feels like home." The church had become the place where she knew brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers in the midst of a life that she had only known full of brokenness. And that's been my experience. Wherever I've gone in the world, regardless of culture and language and social backgrounds, whether it's been in Moscow, Russia, or it's been in Tegucigalpa and the slums of Honduras, or Tecate, Mexico, among those who didn't speak my language, whether it was in Russian or Spanish or whatever language it was, there was something that connected me with other Christians deep in the heart. In knowing them, that they loved the same God that I loved, that their heart was beating with the same desires, that we might not be able to speak the same tongue language, but we could speak the same heart language. Because that's what happens in a family, that we speak the same heart language, the language of heaven, when His word informs our heart as we bear His name, so that as we do that, we find we are truly at home with God and with one another.